Hello folks. Now, although it appears that we're in just some thick, dense forest, something that might seem just so insignificant, we are in uncharted territory here right now. Because guess what? We are in South Carolina, our 21st state. I give you all a warm welcome to the Palmetto State. That's right, we are going ever more south, and we're reaching the part of the south that we have not been to before. It'll be a great adventure these next several weeks. Now you know what time it is. It's time to play that special game I play with you all anytime we reach a new state. So what do you think of when you hear of the state of South Carolina? You might think of the palmettos all across the lowlands of the state. It's a state symbol on the state license plate, on the flag. It's everywhere. You might think of the lush vegetation that places like these might remind you of. You might think of the beautiful coastal city of Charleston, premier vacation spot for many tourists to see the old side of the South. Now, as we approach a lot of these new southern states, every time I'm going to remind you, these states were once broken away, part of another country for a few years, the Confederacy. Their values didn't really align with today's modern ethical values. Of course, they had, unfortunately, a lot of slavery going on. South Carolina was no exception here. It was actually the first state to secede from the Union to join the Confederacy. Overall, South Carolina is a great example that epitomizes what it feels like to be in the old coastal South, between South Carolina and North Carolina, which were once the same entity. Up until the early 18th century, North Carolina and South Carolina were one colony. They broke off some decades before the Revolution and are now treated as two different states with similar but different cultures. And of course, who can forget the South Carolina beaches? You got Myrtle Beach in the north, and then you got Hilton Head Island in the south. Lots of tourists flock there, but we are not going there. You know us here on the Coverage Project, we try not to go to these well-frequented places if they have nothing to offer but just that resort experience. We go to the places that hold a lot of geographical, cultural, historical significance, and where we are right now is a great example, even though we're in the middle of the woods. So as we've begun walking, you'll notice that there is this long boardwalk, elevated higher than the ground below us. As you can see, with all the mud and the water, that's probably to protect us. That's probably to help us with our lovely day here and not get our shoes wet. Where we are is one of the last great preserved tracts of land in this Atlantic South region. What once was this huge forest, this Atlantic coastal forest. In the last couple hundred years, it was all chopped down for various purposes, and only a few bits of the old growth forest remain here. This is Congaree National Park. Wow, that is a large tree right there. And as we progress along this boardwalk farther and farther, you'll see that the trees get much taller and become a different kind of tree, and the environment around us becomes more damp and swampy. From New Jersey all the way down to Georgia, the parts of land closest to the Atlantic Ocean were dominated by these swampy forests. These forests that were so wet and damp that they have their own ecosystem. We're really getting into the swamp of it all. So vegetation, the trees and plants you'd find here, have to withstand a lot of the unrelenting weather of this oceanic climate. Hurricanes and heavy rainfall. That combined with the seasonal flooding of all these rivers, and it makes for a very swampy, marshy environment. Oh, wow, look at all this. Must be very, very hard to develop a society, a human society that is, when everything's so wet and gross, honestly. I think that's what we have here at dwarf palmetto. It's a relative of the palmetto, the state tree, but it's quite smaller. Now, Congaree National Park isn't the most visited national park. It's not as well known as the likes of Grand Canyon and Yosemite and Yellowstone, but it does hold its fair share of natural beauty. Now look at these trees, they're just submerged under the water. It definitely takes a lot of evolution for these trees to adapt to this flood-prone environment. And it used to be that you could find these trees all over the southeast. But as people come into the region, of course, they change the environment. And so you don't see these things anymore. This whole place is just flooded. I can only imagine what it would be during the dry season. As it stands, it looks just spectacular for a sight. So as a result of the unfortunate history we cannot change of the development and destruction of a large part of these once abundant forests here in the southeast, Congaree National Park stands as one of those last remnants. So it's a great thing that we get to see this for ourselves. Now, for a floodplain forest, like here in Congaree National Park, the flood's gotta come from somewhere, right? Now, this is an oxbow lake. It's not a river, but when a river changes course and the water that remains there stays stagnant, doesn't flow everywhere, that's when you get this long stretch that looks like a river for a little bit, and it was a river, but it's not a river anymore. This is one of those oxbow lakes of the Congaree River. The Congaree River is a tributary of the Santee River, and the Santee River is one of South Carolina's most prominent rivers. And it's a nice, grand old view of all the water that eventually gets into this whole area. Oh my goodness. Is this supposed to be an accessible trail? Maybe since it's flooding so much, it's just not so accessible, but we'll find a way. Yeah, one of the perks of traveling solo. You don't have to compromise with anybody about the way to do things, or the direction you're going, or the paths you want to take. As much as this swampy water is cold, it's quite an adventure, just to live life freely. So I guess here in Congaree we're getting the true traveler's adventure, and we're literally going off the beaten path. I also want to make it clear, this Congaree National Park, way before it became a national park, was very known about. The Congaree tribe, which this park and the river is named for, inhabited the lands around this area and utilized this swampy forests area for all of their needs. Water, food, a place to hide. Speaking of hiding, South Carolina does have a history of slavery, and occasionally bands of runaway slaves would come to this Congaree area, and because it's very well hidden and it's not that accessible, it was a great place for these runaway slaves, called maroons, to make their simple living. At least they weren't slaves anymore. They could be free and get what they needed out of this environment. Oh my goodness, look at the size of that tree. You can really only find it in these protected, preserved places. Everywhere else you're going to find either these smaller trees that were planted way later, or you're going to just see fields, because a lot of this southeast area was developed into farmland. With all the flooding and waters around us, it made for some very fertile soil. I'd say if you come here and it's flooded as much as this, get your feet wet. Take off your shoes, socks, have a little fun in the swampy, murky water. Get off the beaten tourist boardwalk trail, because it's nice to have this entire forest to yourself. It's a surreal, almost enchanting experience. By far not the most visited national park. You might be surprised to discover today that there is a national park in South Carolina. If you do visit here, you'll be immensely rewarded with a very unique ecosystem and environment that brings you back to the days of yesteryear in this lush but very swampy environment. And it's a type of environment that you might not really see all too often anymore, even in the southeast. I wanted us to debut here in Congaree National Park as our first location of South Carolina, because this is what South Carolina, or at least much of it, used to look like. So I felt it was important to really showcase the natural beauty of this state. We are on the same continuous boardwalk loop, yet it seems like we've really done a lot here. So I'll end by saying this: if you want a national park experience that feels more low-key, more like a state park, or just some other protected area without the title of national park, come to Congaree. I think this is a very underrated location. And I'm proud to call this number 7 on our list of national parks visited. Oh man, this is gonna be tough to cross. Oh, this is moving. I don't know if you can see it, but it's kind of an unstable boardwalk right here. I guess this is the perfect place to conclude the video. So right here, with my ankles wet in some swamp water, here in this fantastic, unforgettable floodplain forest in South Carolina, not knowing if I'm gonna make it across that boardwalk. More travels to come. I will see you at the next location. Oh my goodness, that is cold.